As we examine the ruthless advance of the Trump regime's authoritarian assault on civil society, on democracy, on due process and constitutional freedoms, it's worth examining some of the differences between the first Trump administration and this second Trump regime. And I think one area that's been perhaps underexamined, one dynamic that has been discussed has been the ways in which the courts have been there more or less for Trump in this administration versus the last one. But one, I think, really critical dynamic is the exclusive presence of partisan Trump MAGA loyalists within the executive branch, whereas the first Trump administration had figures we might have disagreed with on policy grounds, like Attorney General Sessions or somebody like General Milley. These were ultimately people who ascribed to long-held rules and laws and norms, did things like recuse themselves from the Mueller investigation in the case of AG Sessions. But part of Project 2025, an essential part of it, was to root out anybody who would stand up against Trump's tyrannical reign. And that is what we've seen be the prevailing theme of this first 6 months of Trump's return to power, is the installation of loyalists, whether they be executive branch cabinet officials or judges like Third Circuit henchman Emil Bovee, who was recently confirmed by the Senate. And one area where I wanted to dig in today on this return episode of Legal AF with Court Accountability Action, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our work, is on the installation and the manipulation of laws, the defiance of laws, frankly, around the appointment of U.S. attorneys. These are critical frontline prosecutors, the leading federal prosecutors in each state. And to discuss the ways in which the MAGA Trump administration is breaking the law to install loyalist prosecutors in circumvention of the Senate's advice and consent role, I'm thrilled to be joined by a stalwart leader on the Senate Judiciary Committee, the great Senator Dick Blumenthal from Connecticut. Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Sorry for the long windup. Thrilled to have you with us to dig into this important issue.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great lead into a very, very important topic. And you're absolutely right on all counts that political fealty has become the qualification, the defining criteria for all of these appointments. And it is really repugnant. I say that as a former United States attorney myself, the chief federal prosecutor for Connecticut, as well as the state attorney general, which is an elected position and a political one. But the U.S. attorney position is part of the Department of Justice and should be above and outside politics. And that norm, tradition, rule, whatever you want to call it, has been just repeatedly and blatantly defied by this administration.
And there is some history in this context of political interference going back to the George W. Bush administration. There was a big scandal. It's kind of quaint to think about now that it rose to the level of scandal that it did, where there was political interference in U.S. attorney hiring and firing. But here now that we're talking about something on a completely different scale, there are federal statutes on the books that are on the books specifically to constrain this type of political abuse of the Justice Department. Can you tell us a little bit more, Senator, about how the Trump administration is manipulating and defying those statutes?
Well, what they're doing essentially is to try to end run the Congress. This position requires confirmation from the Senate. The advice and consent of the Senate is a measure of how important the position is, that it requires confirmation. And for example, in New Jersey or in the Central District of California or even in the Northern District of New York, what they've done is try to appoint interim United States attorneys, but the term there is 120 days. So sometimes they've tried to reappoint them for 120 days without congressional approval. In some instances, for example, in New Jersey, they have exhausted the 120 days for Alina Habba. And so they've tried to make her acting United States attorney. Well, the statutes simply don't authorize the Department of Justice or the Attorney General or even the President to appoint an acting United States attorney. And so there's a judge in Pennsylvania who has concluded she is without authority for any of the actions she has taken. You know, for a United States attorney to be making decisions and taking actions without authority means those prosecutions, when they're brought to court, could be challenged successfully. Everything she's done could be challenged. Everything that her assistant U.S. attorneys have done could be challenged. It is a major upheaval, a cause of chaos in that district for these kinds of shenanigans and manipulations to go on.
And particularly rich, against the backdrop of this federal invasion, this militarized invasion of blue cities on this sort of propagandized line about crime being out of control. And meanwhile, they're going to, presumably round up a bunch of protesters or other people that are causing problems in these cities, allegedly, and then pursue federal prosecutions that now seem fatally flawed and defected from the very start. So, like, even if we take their line to be true that this is a problem, they're hamstringing their own ability to find any accountability for these alleged kind of public safety crises.
And it's not only that they may be without authority, but she has also begun investigations of the governor of New Jersey, who happens to be a Democrat, of a congressman woman in New Jersey who happens to be a Democrat. She has said one of her objectives as United States attorney, I'm talking about Alina Habba, is to turn New Jersey red. And the overt use of this office for political purposes, the weaponization of the United States Attorney's Office is so deeply dangerous to our system. Put aside the chaos they are creating, which, as you well say, kind of totally contradicts the idea they're going to be crime fighters when they're creating chaos in the criminal justice system to prosecute those criminals. It really is head spinning.
It's also, Senator, against this backdrop of all of these other conflicts that the administration is agitating with the judiciary as it circumvents orders, as it defies orders, as it seeks emergency relief in an interlocutory posture, doing strange things to put real pressure, and actually, lowering themselves to threats and accusations of judicial coups and the like. So I guess I'm wondering. So in the context of that broader conflict that the administration is pressing with the courts, how does this conflict kind of play in, and how do you see those kind of dynamics unfolding as these prosecutions continue, as the militarization and politicization of law enforcement continues? And I'm reminded also of a story that broke this morning we talked about before we started taping, but 10 judges today have come out with serious concerns about threats to judges and the lack of defense and protection from the Supreme Court and John Roberts that we're seeing in this kind of critical moment of crisis.
This administration is shredding the credibility of the United States as a plaintiff, as a party before the federal courts. When I went into court as United States attorney, and I think it's true of every federal prosecutor, there was a belief that the lawyer for the people of the United States, the government's lawyer, was going to hold himself or herself to a high standard.
The highest.
And the highest standard, that you would never, ever shade the truth to a judge, that you would admit that there was evidence contrary to your case, because that's the Brady rule, providing for exculpatory evidence. And when and if it ever occurred that there was a violation of that rule, there would be severe discipline. In other words, the credibility of the government's lawyer was high because they earned it. Now, what we're seeing is the wholesale shredding of that credibility. The district court judges who are anonymously complaining about the lack of protection and the lack of credibility on the part of the United States government I think, reflect a much broader feeling among judges, regardless of who appointed them. This is not a Republican or Democratic issue. I think there's a general feeling among the federal judiciary that this administration is really very different in the way it approaches the law. And if you believe the law is important and that the norms and rules should be followed regardless of whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration, it's deeply disturbing, in fact, abhorrent.
Yeah. And they're hamstrung, right? These judges are in a position where, as you note, they had to speak anonymously. There are retired judges that are speaking out along these lines. But for the most part, the judges who are in the line of fire, who are being put into these daily situations of duress and kind of doing this really important and challenging work of trying to apply the law to a fast-moving and manipulated factual environment, as you note, with flagrant lies being advanced to the court by Justice Department lawyers. It's hard to imagine being in that position and not really being able to advocate for themselves. And the fact that they're resorting to going to the press like this, I think, is quite telling. I do wonder how this is playing out on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Obviously, you're continuing to process nominations. We had a hearing yesterday with more very problematic and concerning judicial nominees. I thought your questioning was excellent. But how are your Republican colleagues processing this, particularly vis-a-vis the threats to the judges, which we've been able to have bipartisan cooperation around addressing in the past? But now it's kind of reaching a fever pitch, and I wonder if there's something to be done maybe around the Marshals Act or something like that.
My Republican colleagues recognize the threat, but they're in denial about what their responsibility is for it. And I say that, as we say commonly in the Senate, with all due respect. I want to be very blunt. They know what's going on. They simply lack the backbone to help us stop it. And clearly there have been moments in our nation's history when members of Congress respected an advocate saying to them, "Have you no shame?" And the combination of public disapproval and conscience within this body made a difference. And I hope we can return to that point. But I have no hope, having lived through Mueller and that investigation, having gone through the impeachment proceedings, two of them, having watched my Republican colleagues cave under the pressure of the Trump cult. I am not going to sound a rose-colored glass optimistic note.
Thanks, Senator. I think that's important, right? I think we have to reckon really honestly and with clear eyes about the moment in time we are in. And I think it also it demands, I think, deep reflection and strategic consideration about how we should proceed as defenders of democracy, as people that are committed to freedom and protecting particularly vulnerable people against this affront and assault on their basic autonomy and freedom. How we can start to turn the tide on this. Certainly exposing and confronting and shaming and trying to help these people find decency, we need to keep doing, but it seems, as you note, insufficient. And I wonder if you have thoughts about, how Democrats in particular in this moment should think about cooperating with the Trump administration, with congressional Republicans, particularly on these kind of big ticket questions of defense authorization, funding the government, where all indications are that we are dealing with an authoritarian movement that is intent on entrenching itself permanently in power and not handing back power. Why does it make sense to work with them to keep things moving? I know it would create a tremendous pain for communities to I think engage in tactics or strategic approaches like I'm suggesting. But I do kind of wonder how you all are thinking about this.
I voted against every nominee for the Department of Justice in this administration. I voted against every district court nominee and every United States attorney nominee, and I will continue in that record, as well as other nominees in other departments of this government, because almost all of them are completely unfit. How do we deal with the larger issue of the trend toward weaponizing politically the Department of Justice and about militarizing our Department of Justice. To fill immigration judge positions, the administration is taking Department of Defense lawyers. Obviously, it's taking Department of Defense personnel, our National Guard, and putting them on the streets to do law enforcement. The Secretary of Defense says that the principal mission of the Department of Justice will be to protect the homeland against criminal and national security violations within this country, or the kind of clandestine attack that might be launched from without the country, outside the country. But it seems like a very law enforcement oriented mission. So we're seeing a fundamental kind of sea change in the way our military is involved in enforcing the laws domestically, despite posse comitatus and the limitations of the Insurrection Act. The president is not only pushing the boundaries, he's going outside the boundaries in the use of the military, and at the same time, the politicization and weaponization of justice in this country. And we need to sound the alarm so that the American people understand that what goes around comes around. Any president can do it. And the slide toward autocracy is one that we all have to stop. Our next opportunity, most effective opportunity, will be the elections. And I'll tell you, we just finished a recess period where we had a few weeks to be at home, working at home, as I did, going around the state, hearing from people. I attended quite a few indivisible rallies, other kinds of town meetings and informal gatherings. And I'm hearing the question again and again, what can we do? And of course, participating in those rallies is a start. Supporting organizations that are challenging these developments in court. Alina Habba's acting appointment is being challenged in court. Organizations mounting those challenges need resources. Supporting them is really important. And then, of course, making sure people are registered to vote, that they will vote, that they understand the importance of voting, because that's why Donald Trump is president. Because I think a lot of people simply look the other way. And I think that the time has come to mount a full-throated, full-court press to make sure that we focus on these next elections.
Yeah, indeed. And not only is it urgent and needed for us all to lean in at this moment, but also this overreach, this breakdown in our, really deeply flawed system, which has had big problems for working people, everyday people for a long time. It provides an opportunity for us, right, to imagine and envision something better that really works for people. And
we ought to approach it with anger and apprehension, yeah, but also with a clear sense of historic opportunity. I'll tell you a story. I went to the 80th anniversary of the Normandy landing, D-Day, last year, and met a number of the veterans who went to Normandy and fought their way across the beaches and up the cliffs. On the first wave, 90% died. On the second wave, 80%. I walked on the beaches of Normandy. They're absolutely flat. There's no cover. There are no trees. There are no dunes. And I said to one of the veterans, what was it like? He said, this was our moment. This was our moment. They liberated Europe. They preserved democracy. They kept going despite the machine guns and the mortars. And now for us, in our democracy at this moment, this is our moment. And I think we need to approach it with that historic sense of opportunity.
Indeed. Senator Blumenthal, I can't say it any better than that. So with enormous gratitude for your leadership, for your time, Friends, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay mad, stay motivated, stay mighty. Till next time.
Stay angry, but also hopeful.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.